This topic is a profoundly relevant theme, and the recently published book, Two Societies, The Rioting of 1967 and the Writing of the Kerner Report by local author and scholar Rick Loessberg. This historical study reveals so much about the causes and reactions to the unrest in the 1960s, the quest for understanding why and what to do about it, and the salient questions about race and national responsibility. And we are deeply honored to welcome this highly respected scholar whose in-depth research, experience, and scholarship will help place into context the Kerner Report of 1967 and Two Societies. Rick has spent nearly 40 years across local, state, and local governments, including more than 2 decades as Dallas County's Director of Planning and Development. And he also steered the Dallas County Historical Commission, which was originally the entity which was charged with the real challenge of creating a semi-temporary exhibition on the 6th floor of this building, the 6th floor exhibit, which opened in 1989. And it's evolved into what the museum is today. And this month we are celebrating the museum's 37th birthday, and we'll hope we'll have 37 more and then some. We're extremely privileged also to welcome Darryl Martin, who's serving as our moderator. Darryl has advanced degrees in social work and public administration and many years of vision and experience. He brings community-focused perspective to the conversation this evening. And before I turn the floor over to Darryl and to Rick, I'd like to thank you all so much for coming, for expressing interest in this little-known report from 1967, to our guest speakers, and also to the fabulous team at the 6th Floor Museum. And so many of the staff, many of whom are new, helped put this program together, and I especially want to give a shout out to the education team for taking this event, which has been a year at least in the making, so taking it to liftoff. So over to Darryl, and thank you so much, and do come to our other programs. They're going to be really meaningful, and you'll learn so many different aspects about Dallas history.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for that introduction. For both Rick and I, we know each other a little differently, though. We won't talk about that here. Rick, and I have these notes just for you guys, so you guys know, because Rick and I have talked about this subject over the last 17 years, many, many times, and we've been known to go off script quite a bit. So the notes are for me, not for Rick, okay? Make sure I answer the questions that I think are important, and because we want to hear answers from Rick. But Rick, 1967, 1968 were very difficult times for the United States, and I remember them directly, particularly the riots of 1967, 1968. I was a young man at the time. I was a young boy at the time. But I remember every time a riot broke out, my mom would hop in the car. She'd get the word by telephone. No cell phones at the time, of course. But she'd get word by telephone, and all the mothers, some of the fathers, get in the car and run around picking up the children. Because I had a brother and sister, 15, 16 years old, very much into the Stokely Carmichael, Black Panther movement. So every time a riot broke out, they needed to be there. They felt they needed to be there. But we also know what happens with riots, and police come and people get hurt. And that happened to my brother at one time. So my mother saw it upon herself to throw us in the back of the car, and she'd ride around the neighborhood. She'd pick up not only her kids, but other kids in the neighborhood, drop them back at home, and find as many people as she could before the police got there and started arresting people, okay? So that period was very real for me. So I guess we'll start with a couple of questions. One, what got a white kid from the suburbs of Dallas interested in this subject? And tell us a little bit about the Kerner Report.
Well, how I got interested in this, I came from a family that subscribed to both a morning newspaper and an evening newspaper, back when there were newspapers. And my parents would always watch the network news, and they were avid readers. Dad would read Business Week, and we subscribed to Time Magazine and Life Magazine and Look Magazine. And so every evening, we would have the television on as dinner was approaching, and we'd see, the evening news, and we seemed to watch Huntley and Brinkley on NBC more times than others. And you're seeing every night, it seemed in 1967 that there was a riot somewhere. And as the year progressed from spring into summer, the riots seemed to be more frequent and more violent and destructive. And in all, by the end of the summer of '67, there were riots in black neighborhoods of more than 150 cities. And there had never been anything quite like that. And the visuals and the statistics were just horrifying. And again, I'm like 11 years old, about to be 11 years old that year. And I'm watching this, and I'm seeing tanks go down American streets. And I see soldiers and National Guardsmen with bayonets hiding behind parked cars. And you're hearing the pop, pop, pop of rifle fire. And I'm wondering what the heck is going on here, because I was aware that we were fighting a war on poverty. And so there was this huge disconnect. And that started something what I needed to know the answer. And oftentimes when you start to investigate something or you become interested, the more questions you have answered, the more questions you develop. And it was something I could never shake. So you fast forward 10 years, and I'm a sophomore at the University of Oklahoma. And in one of the books we were using in our poli-sci class was the actual summary from the Kerner Report. And it talked about in the preface to this chapter that this was an elitist response to collective violence. You got to remember this is like 1977, so we use terms like that all the time. And it talked about that this was a very controversial report. And so I read the summary, and I'm sitting there thinking, it doesn't seem that controversial to me. What happened to it? So the quest continues. I go to graduate school, do my master's thesis on what I thought happened to the report. I started my career in public service, and then I had a different appreciation for the report. Because as I started staffing special committees or serving on special committees, or I would see firsthand on a Monday morning or a Tuesday morning with Commissioner's Court, how consensus was made and how difficult that often was, that I just marveled at what the work that these 11 commissioners on this panel did and the work of their staff, because I knew it wasn't easy. So it took on a whole different meaning. And again, as years go by, it still continues to take more, have a special meaning, and I still have more questions, and I hope that I can share some of those questions with you later tonight.
So what made 1967 different from the other years? There were riots in '65, there were riots in '30s, there were riots in Harlem in the '20s and '30s, and so what made this one different, '67 different? I mean,
there were so many of them,
right?
Because usually, and you're right, there was I expected a level of some violence in 1967 because there had been Watts in '65.
Right.
And there was a riot in Harlem and in Cleveland in '66. So we were expecting something to be amiss. And let's go back to the '60s. In general, it was a time of dynamic change. Changes in fashion and culture and mores and music. There was a belief that we could do almost anything. There was modern medicine. We were launching people into space. Oftentimes, though, when you have that rapid change in a society, you have tension and uncertainty. So that was sort of the background. We also had the civil rights movement. And I know from a lot of whites at the time, they were thinking we were making tremendous progress because we had the Great Society. So we were expecting some violence, but not quite like this. And I think it caught everybody by surprise, perhaps, and maybe you can address this a little bit better, maybe even the black community. And you think about this isn't 2 or 3 riots, it's 150. And it's not the ones where, now Watts was extremely violent, but the others that followed it until 1967, and even the early ones in 1967, they were kind of minor. They set some trash cans on fire and they threw rocks at policemen and broke some windows, but it was not unlike probably OU Texas Weekend in downtown Dallas once upon a time. So that's how it was. But then as '67 continued and people started shooting and started setting buildings on fire, not trash cans on fire, everything just changed.
Right.
And I think you have to realize how panic-stricken most of white America was, because in 1967, America was a very segregated country by race. I never would have had the opportunity to work with an African-American like Darryl Martin if I had been an adult in 1967. So as a result of that, when you're seeing the Stokely Carmichaels and the Rat Browns on television, and they got a lot of media exposure, and they're talking about things that violence is as American as cherry pie, and that if America doesn't change, we'll burn it down. A lot of whites, for the lack of no other perspective, came to the conclusion, I guess all blacks feel that way. And so that fueled the panic and the hysteria even more.
Yeah, and you know, Stokely Carmichael was really heavily into the Black Power movement, Black Panthers, and you know, which a lot of people identify with, particularly in the Black community. You know, finally, that felt like, you know, we have a way out. You know, and before we never felt that way. Medgar Evers had been killed already. You know, Malcolm X. You know, a couple of months later, Martin Luther King. But that was before the right. But there was this tension in African American communities. I remember Mom and Dad sitting around, you know, the table talking about that. You know, but what's next? What's next? And I guess a lot of people felt, you know, what's next is probably a race war.
And I think white America was coming to that conclusion because when the riots occurred, I think almost every American city, because you have to remember, the riots were in just about every kind of community you can imagine. They were in Boston, to Tampa, to Tucson, to Middle America, Omaha. And it didn't matter whether the cities were, and the black populations were large or small, they all seemed to be susceptible to this.
Right.
And there were rumors that, you know, carloads of blacks were going to white neighborhoods and were going to kill white families while they were sleeping. I mean, it was as polarized as today is. It seemed like for many, the opening shots of a race war had started.
And I bet that's how it felt. And I think I shared with you right around the time that I guess you were writing this book, the movie Detroit came out.
Yes.
And I remember sitting in the theater watching Detroit at the Draft House around the corner, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I mean, it was literally that tense during the movie.
Yes.
I felt immobilized. I felt like something was happening to me, and I felt the pain in a lot of the black people's voices and when they were being shot and killed and beaten. And I remember how just difficult that was to watch. And like you said, back then it was television. People were actually seeing this stuff in real time, and the tanks rolling down the street and all of that. So there was a lot of tension, I'm sure, and people were scared.
They were scared.
So what did Washington do? You know?
Well, Washington, of course, was always quick to look for conspiracies. And that was where, in fact, public opinion polling showed that 3/4 of white America believed that it was a combination of communists and criminals who were responsible for the rioting. Lyndon Johnson decided to appoint a special committee. Now, for those of us who work in government or work for large organizations, we often joke, that's what you do when you don't know what else to do, is you appoint a committee.
That's right.
But this one was, actually, if you think about it, it was a very shrewd maneuver on LBJ's part. He actually sort of allowed the nation to catch its breath for a year because he charged this commission with investigative powers to determine what had happened, why, and what could be done to prevent it, and gave them a year deadline. So that sort of curtailed some of the discussion on Capitol Hill because it's like, well, we'll wait for the president's commission to finish. And it helped take it out of the spotlight for a while. 7 months later, ahead of schedule, the commission delivered its report, and the 11-member commission unanimously concluded that the rioting was not the result of a conspiracy, was not the result of criminals or riffraff or losers. It determined that it was a reaction to decades of what it called pervasive segregation and discrimination. And it warned that despite all the advancements of the last decade, the nation was still moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal.
Yeah, which again is the title of a great book that I encourage everybody to get. What were some of the, and I recognize there was a lot of things going on in Washington at the time as well, particularly with Lyndon Johnson. I mean, he was in the middle of, you know, initially hiding a war that was escalating on us, you know. He was also in the middle of a re-election campaign. He was trying to walk that tightrope with everything that he was dealing with as well. So he was very careful about who he put on the committee. But what fascinated me about this committee is that it didn't have any of the big names that you would expect.
No, it did not. It did not. Now, you know, Lyndon Johnson, if you study his presidency, he loves special committees. He may have appointed more special committees than anybody. And he always wanted them to be as representative as possible. He was very much the politician, the legislative deal maker.
Right.
And he wanted to bring everybody together. So he appointed these 11 individuals. And Darryl is right. People looked at it, at the people who were appointed, and in liberal circles, it was really heavily criticized for being, if you simply look at it, we've got circulating pictures of the individuals there.
Mm-hmm.
They're a bunch of middle-aged white guys. The median age was 57. Mm-hmm. 2 of the 11 were of color. And of the 2 who were of color, one was the first black senator from since Reconstruction, Edmund Brooke, mm-hmm. and the other was Roy Wilkins, who was head of the NAACP. But the reality was the NAACP was seeming to be a group of sort of old fogies, mm-hmm. Compared to the young activists. Mm-hmm. People were wondering, well, where's James Farmer, for instance? Yeah. Where's John Lewis? Well, yeah. He's not there. Martin Luther King wasn't appointed because of his stance on the Vietnam War. And so everybody was expecting, oh gosh, it's going to be a real boring report. And they're going to conclude, like all other riot reports, that it was a handful of miscreants, that it was not reflective of a particular community or a particular population. And that's what everybody expected. And when you think of the people who are on that commission, and we can talk about that a little bit further, besides them being white and middle-aged, these are the types of people who were on there. There was a senator from Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. There was a radio station owner from Kentucky. There was a self-made millionaire from West Texas who believed in the bootstrap mythology as much as he believed in the American flag. Mm-hmm. And there was a white Southern police chief at a time when that was not necessarily the most enlightened of occupations. Yet somehow those 4 or 5 people who you never would have thought would have signed off on a report that was as bold and unexpected as this, they did that.
They did that.
They did that.
Yep. Yep.
And that was some of what I think shocked and stunned America, because it wasn't expected.
Right.
And as a result of that stunning reality or that reaction, the major networks preempted their regular programming for special coverage. Newspapers ran with really big headlines saying racism blamed for riots. Mm-hmm. You saw the public bought 1 million copies of this report in 2 weeks. That outsold the Warren Report. So people were more interested in why they were rioting in 1967 than who had shot JFK, mm-hmm. to put it in perspective as to how scared and how concerned America was.
Right. But you mentioned, even though they were mostly homogenous group, we had a couple of blacks, you had one woman.
Yep.
But they came from different backgrounds and had different thoughts about why the riots. We thought, I bet you they thought at the time that the riots were caused by black folks who just, didn't have anything else to do, or something like that.
Well, and staff said that when they had their first meeting, all they could talk about was Rat Brown and Stokely Carmichael.
Right.
That's all they could talk about.
Right.
And when you look at their meeting minutes over the 5 or 6 months where they were actively debating the causes of the rioting, you see sort of comments about that they're leaning into that discussion.
Right.
But over time, you can see that is not part of it anymore. Mm-hmm. After about 3 months, and we could talk about this, how they got there, they determined that it was discrimination and racism, and it wasn't a conspiracy.
Right. So tell me how they got to unanimous. I mean, there must have been a lot of skill from the staff working with this group that they got to unanimous decisions, which never happens now, One day Congress will get there, but that'll be long after most of us in this room are gone. I mean, how do you get to a unanimous decision with a group like this, Rick?
Well, there were a combination of factors what they did. One is that this group of 11 was not content just to sit in a conference room for 3 or 4 hours at a time and listen to somebody do a briefing, mm-hmm. or read a report on their own. They chose to go out into the field. And all of them went to at least 2 or 3 cities. And, there is, for those of us who've traveled abroad or other parts of the country, there is no substitute for actually being there.
Right.
And what they saw blew them away, for lack of a better expression. They would comment on how they would see piles and piles of trash that had been set out to be picked up by the garbage men, but it was still standing there after weeks. And one of the commission members, Fred Harris, told me, he said, 40 years later, he could still remember that smell of stuff, mm-hmm. rotting there on the curb. They would walk past a vacant lot with weeds and broken glass, and were told that that was the park that kids could play in.
Mm-hmm.
They would go to the schools and they would see the paint peeling off of the walls, and they were seeing textbooks done from 10, 15 years ago. And so,
Right.
of course, there was no such thing as that we were going to launch rockets or find vaccinations for polio or anything like that in any of these textbooks.
And it was lead paint, I'm sure.
Oh, you know it was lead paint.
Exactly.
And so then they would go to City Hall, and they would do a lot of these tours unannounced.
Mm-hmm.
So then they would go to City Hall and talk to the mayor and the powers that be, and the response was one of indignation. It's like, well, we don't have a problem here.
Right.
Well, you know, what are you talking about?
Right.
And what the commission member said is that's what changed their thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Otto Kerner, who was the chairman of the commission, he was the governor of Illinois. He was from Chicago, and his father-in-law had been mayor of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And he says he considered himself, as he said, a self-professed city boy, but he was shocked by what he saw. And then Charles Thornton, who was the self-made millionaire from West Texas, said he was stunned by what he saw, and it caused a change of 180 degrees in his thinking as to what caused the rioting. Now, for them, since they had gone there, and yes, they'd seen the statistics and everything, but they had seen and they had talked to people, they concluded, well, I'm getting ahead of myself.
Because I just want to jump in for 1 second, because one of them actually visited a barbershop.
Yes.
One of the white
Yes.
members
Fred
visited
Harris.
a barbershop.
Yes.
And I don't know if any of you have ever been to a black barbershop, but or a beauty salon, but a lot of things happens in the black barbershop or the black beauty salon, but that's where a lot of information gets out. That's where a lot of people start talking politics and those kind of things. So it's very important. I was impressed that one of them actually spent time in a barbershop listening to black men.
And you know, that just shows you the kind of commitment that they had.
Right.
And they would, and Fred Harris in particular would talk about he would enter into these barbershops, and initially they really didn't want to talk to him.
Mm-hmm.
They would shut down really quick. But Fred had this really folksy way of getting people to open up and engage, and then they'd start talking. And they would say stuff like, you know, I don't know what else to do. You know, I need a job.
Right.
You know, we're trying hard, but nobody seems to care.
Right.
And, you know, that was, as they say, you know, you experience that firsthand from the people that are there. And yes, you could do public opinion polling, which is what they actually did in the riot area, which
Mm-hmm.
makes their findings a little bit more different than others because it was based on empirical data in part. You can look at the numbers, but you hear the voices and you see the faces, and that's a lot different.
That's a lot different. That's a lot different. So talk to me then a little bit about some of the recommendations. You said they came to a unanimous decision, but they were some hard-hitting decisions. They were real and they were raw, Rick.
They were, and you know, the thing, and this is one of the takeaways that I think that we can get from the Kerner Report, while it's almost 60 years old, is the fact that they were able to come to a unanimous agreement on the basic reasons for why there was rioting. As Darryl referenced, we can't get Congress to agree on anything today, let alone it be 60 votes, let alone 100. That just doesn't seem possible. But yet these individuals were able to do that. So how did they do that? Well, they had a very skillful executive director who reminds me of some people in this room, who guided them through the process. But what the first thing they did is that they were committed to finding a solution.
Right.
And they treated each other with respect. They did not call each other racist or fascist or woke or you know, anything like that. But they had their disagreements. As one of the staff people told me, that didn't mean they sat around the conference table and sang campfire songs. They had some very serious, very difficult conversations, but they did it with respect. They chose to focus on first what they had in common and then work from there. And what they often found was the difference was one of tone or emphasis, and that there was a way to do, to modify some of the wording to achieve more unanimity. And let me give you an example. They were working on the chapter of the report that was talking about employment and training and how to increase employment opportunities and the living standards for people who are working. And one of the draft recommendations said the best way to do this was to raise the minimum wage. Well, you go, okay, that sounds pretty logical to me. But then others started chiming in and said, no, it's not the best way. The best way is to have a training program. Another one said, no, the best way is to bring back a program like the WPA, where we can employ people who need a job. Then another one said, no, we need a summer youth employment program. And then another one said, no, we need tax incentives so we can encourage businesses to be in the inner city. And then finally, one member, who typically was usually the most quiet member of the 11, just chimed in and said, rather than saying the best way to do it is to raise the minimum wage, why don't we just say one way is to raise the minimum wage? And suddenly they go, oh yeah, that's it. Now you sit, for those of you in the audience, a lot of you may go, well, that seems kind of obvious and kind of silly, and why couldn't they think of that? But for those of us who've done this, Alan Clemson, we know that that is a very real situation. And I can't tell you how many times where I was sitting behind you or sitting behind Alan, and we're seeing the court stumble, I don't want to say stumble, but having a difficult time finding the wording. And we're passing messages to one another about how about this, and that's how it would be done. That's right.
And it works.
Yeah, it's not glamorous or sexy, but that's how it's done.
That's how it's done. So talk to me about the recommendations. Like you said, give me an example of one of the recommendations that was really hard-hitting that they put in the report despite knowing it was going to get some pushback.
Well, there's 600 pages in this report, and probably about 110 of them are devoted to recommendations. The ones that got the most attention are the ones that would have required congressional approval. But there are many, many others that were the responsibility of local entities or corporations or the media, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But one of the recommendations that they made involved welfare. At that time, welfare was predominantly a program for only single mothers with children, not two-parent households. And only probably maybe 20 of the 50 states in the country had a provision where if you had both parents present, you could qualify for welfare. And what the concern was because of that, that encouraged fathers to abandon the family so that the family could qualify for welfare. And that was one of the recommendations that they made. Much to everybody's surprise, Richard Nixon proposed a radical overhaul of welfare in 1969. They passed the House, but never could get out of the Senate Finance Committee. But it had that in there. It eventually got adopted, but it took 20 years before that provision was put in. So welfare reform, as we know, has always been very, very hard.
So the recommendations are made, the report goes out. What kind of response did it get from the nation? What happened after the...
Like I said, initially the reaction was tremendous. Even someone like conservative columnist James Kilpatrick talked about that because of the extensive documentation in this report, as he said, there's no denying that the problems that they outlined exist. So that was phenomenal that he acknowledged that. A lot of other conservative publications praised it and complimented it for its meticulous research. Oftentimes, though, we live in a very dynamic world, and soon external events began to overtake the report. If you look at 2 weeks after the report was released, Robert Kennedy announces he's running for president. 2 weeks after that, Lyndon Johnson announces suddenly he's not running for president anymore. A week after that, Martin Luther King is killed. 2 months after that, Robert Kennedy is killed. So there were many, many other things on people's mind other than this 600-page report very, very soon. 2 other things came into play for why sort of the air started to leak out of the balloon was that fiscal conservatives were concerned with how are we going to pay for all these recommendations. Again, we're fighting a war already in Vietnam, and we're fighting a war on poverty. And now you're asking us to expand that war on poverty when Lyndon Johnson, this is incredible to believe that he actually did this, he had already just recently asked Congress to temporarily raise income taxes to pay for what we had. And Congress actually agreed to do that, which is even more unremarkable. So there was that. And then there was also white America who was very uncomfortable with the findings. They believed that because white society was so heavily criticized in the report, that they were being blamed more significantly for the rioting than the people who actually took to the streets.
Well, there was a leak, right, of the report that came out, and the newspaper got it and actually said riots caused by white racism.
Right, and that's what the headline said. And that is really what the report concluded.
Right. And
so, it's an easy thing to, and it's one of the, I'll say, one of the few shortcomings of the report. It's a masterful job what they did in 7 months. Mm-hmm. And you got to remember, no cell phones, no laptops.
Yep.
All they had were IBM Selectric typewriters with little bottles of whiteout. Mm-hmm. And yet they put together this 600-page report. Mm-hmm. And it's really, really quaint because you go through the commission's files at the LBJ Library, and their meeting notices were Western Union telegrams. That was the email of the day. And so it's remarkable that they put something together that is that well documented, and it's actually written very, very well in such a short period of time. But one of the things that they didn't do that I wish they had done is that when they say white society is responsible for the racism, they didn't really give everyday examples of the racism. Right. And so it made it very easy for others to say, well, it's not me. I didn't try to blow up a church in Birmingham, so I'm not a racist. To do that rather than, understand that maybe something they had been doing all along was offensive and they were completely unaware of it.
Right. And then even a lot of black activists felt it didn't go far enough.
Yes.
It made recommendations, but it really didn't go far enough, and they were disappointed as well.
There are some that said that they believed it didn't go far enough into the institutional racism aspect of it.
That's right. So was any of it implemented?
Well, if you look at a lot of the historical record, most historians say no. But I think that because of the massive nature of the report and its recommendations, you need to look at more than just those that would have required congressional action. And I think you need to look at a time frame of more than just 1 or 2 years.
Right.
And when you do that, I have found that a great number of its major recommendations were indeed implemented. The Fair Housing Act was passed. That had basically come back from the dead. No one expected that to be resuscitated, and yet it passed. You had the 1968 Housing Act, which is still the largest housing bill that Congress has ever passed. You had the appropriations for the nation's 2 largest urban assistance programs, Model Cities, which was LBJ's pet program, and Urban Renewal. Those appropriations were doubled in 2 years. You had the EEOC get strengthened, both in terms of its enforcement authority and in its staffing. You saw how local police forces were diversified like you never would have imagined. To the point of today, the national police forces have the same ethnic representation as the population at large. And 38% of the nation's major police departments are headed by African Americans. And in the past, Dallas has had a black police chief, even though blacks are not the largest racial minority in the city of Dallas. So we've made a great deal of progress in that front. And so when I look at that record, I say, yes, it was implemented. It just wasn't implemented maybe at the pace that people had hoped or envisioned.
Right, and I think you talked about, I don't know if you talked about it or I read it, but I think you also mentioned that a lot of the implementation of some of the recommendations occurred at a local level, so they wouldn't get the big splash.
Yeah, exactly. The police departments, for instance, and their procedures on use of deadly force and how you file a grievance and all this. You're exactly right. That wouldn't even probably make the local newspaper, let alone the New York Times or the CBS Evening News.
So why the disconnect? There's something missing, right? I mean,
yeah, there is, and I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that when you're sort of looking at the record, you're hoping for something like the first 100 days of the New Deal, or you've got to go back a little bit more contemporary, the flurry of activity of the first year of the Great Society, where they were passing Medicare and the 64th Civil Rights Act and the tax cuts and all this other stuff. People thought, well, that was what was going to happen there. Well, those are 2 very unique situations that, frankly, talk about once in a lifetime. It's basically, as you can say, twice in a century that situation sort of happened, and both required incredible events, a major economic catastrophe and the death of a president. The other is that you have to realize that, let's see, I guess 8 months after the Kerner Report, Richard Nixon's elected president of the United States. And he was elected largely on a platform of being tough on law, being law and order and crime guy, and on reducing the Great Society. So as Congress is beginning to consider these legislative matters and they get passed and he signs them in the law, he's certainly not going to have an elaborate rose garden ceremony saying, we're fulfilling the Kerner Report.
Well, I'm wondering, you did spend time with Fred Harris, correct?
Yes.
Did you ever talk to him about, was he ever disappointed with how the report was introduced? There was no White House Rose Garden ceremony. None of that occurred for this.
He was disappointed. And you know, the LBJ, he never had the formal photo op ceremony. Right. He never even sent them a letter saying, thank you for your service.
He told them to rip it up. He told them the letter was written for him.
And he said, forget it.
And he said, forget it.
And there's two theories as to why that is so. One is that the media focused heavily on what was needed to be done, not on what had been done. So he had his feelings hurt. The other was Charles Thornton. Early in the commission's days, he was feeding Johnson backdoor information about various proposals that the commission was considering, none of which they subsequently adopted, but he was talking about how John Lindsay, who was the vice chairman, and Fred Harris were running amok, and the commission was going with them. It turned out that didn't happen, but the seeds had already been planted. And again, in defense of Johnson, we all know what an ego he has, but again, think about what was going on at the time that the report was released. The beginning of January, the USS Pueblo gets captured by North Korea. 3 weeks later, the Tet Offensive starts when we thought there was light at the end of the tunnel. Right. It turned out it was the light at the end of a gun in the Saigon embassy.
That's right.
So his world's, and he's hearing rumors that Robert Kennedy is going to run against him. So he had a really bad 1968.
Yeah.
So you can see why he wasn't necessarily thrilled with a report that didn't warmly embrace what he had done.
Right.
And of course, the commission's perspective was, this is for all Americans. It's not for Republicans. It's not for Democrats. It's not for liberals. It's not for conservatives. So they were very cognizant of, we can't make this look partisan.
Right. So you've gotten into the head of a lot of these commissioners. If you ask them, have we made progress 60 years later? We're here in 2026. What do you think they would say?
Well, I posed that question in 2017 as the report's 50th anniversary was coming up. And I was able to ask that to Senator Harris. He was the last of the commission members who was still alive. Virtually all of the senior staff was still alive. And so I asked him that question. And at that time, they were, and let's go back to 2017. That seems like it was 100 years ago already, but it really wasn't. However, we were in the first year of the Trump administration, the first one. You know, he had already said racially insensitive things, so we knew where he stood on certain things. We had already had Ferguson, for instance, just a few years prior to, and Freddie Gray. So we were aware of some things that weren't quite what we thought. So I posed the question to the Kerner folks that I knew, and they all said, yeah, we're concerned, but you know what? We just think it's primarily the fact that we have cell phones so we can record these Ferguson incidents, so we now know more about them than what we used to. And with social media, you know, we've always had crazy people,
right,
and racists. And so these are just these individuals being able to express themselves that we now know about them as well.
Right.
Okay. So let's move forward to 23. I'm working on this book, and so I recontact them and I ask them the same question.
Right.
And they all go, yeah, we slipped. We're going backwards.
And by that time, we'd had George Floyd.
Yes.
Murdered by a police officer.
Yes.
Right? Of course, many people felt, here we go again. It's 1967. Were they alike?
There were a number of noticeable people who were not able to discern the difference between 1967 and 2020, but there were major differences between the two. The only thing they really had in common, first of all, let me back up a second. There were demonstrations throughout the United States over the death of George Floyd, right, whether it was Alaska and in Wyoming, let alone cities like New York City and Boston and right, Minneapolis and everything else, Dallas even. The other point I want to make is that a protest and a demonstration is not a riot.
Right.
99% of the demonstrations were peaceful. But again, some people were not able to discern that difference. The one common factor they had is they were all in response to a police incident. Virtually all of the 1967 riots were a result of a police incident.
That's right.
Usually a misunderstanding, usually a minor incident that somehow got out of hand, or looking back on it, boy, the police that really did not seem like a very good idea. So that's the one commonality. But if you look at everything else, the participants, the location, the level of violence, dramatically different. In 1967, the participants were exclusively African American and 90% male. In 2020, the participants were 50% Anglo, and a third were female. The locations in 1967, they were all in black neighborhoods. In 2020, reflecting that they were usually demonstrations and protests that got out of hand, they were in public spaces or in downtown areas. The most important difference, though, is the level of violence. 1967, as we've said, there were snipers, there was gunfire, there were buildings set on fire, there were 250 fires set in Newark and something like 600 set in Detroit. What you had, and massive looting. What you had in 2020 were people setting trash cans on fire and breaking windows. Storefront windows and stealing stuff that was in the storefront. The level of violence and destruction, there's no comparison whatsoever.
National Guard troops, federal officers. That was the difference between 2020 and, let's say, 2026. One of the recommendations out of the report was the National Guard, if they're going to be used, they need to be trained.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And because National Guard officers, they're federal officers, usually for peace and calm, but a lot of times it's for wars. You need to send them out to fight other people, right? They're not supposed to shoot Americans. They're not supposed to kill Americans. 1967 was different for National Guard troops. And when he said they're slipping, there's a concern about 2026.
There is. And, one of the very first recommendations, in fact, the commission had only been in existence for 2 weeks when it issued its first set of recommendations. And it dealt with the National Guard's performance in Newark and Detroit, where former Secretary of the Army, Cyrus Vance, briefed the commission on the Guard's performance in those two riots. And he said he felt that they contributed to why they were so bad. And it's easy to criticize the National Guard. They were put in a position they were never ever trained for. And so suddenly they're in a dark street, a neighborhood they're not familiar with people they don't know, and they think they're under attack, and they have no idea what's going on. And they've never been trained for anything other than, and let's face it, most National Guards people are trained to be support personnel in the event of a war. They're going to be driving trucks and running offices and things like that. They're not meant to be frontline infantrymen, which is really the job they were put in to do here. And so all they knew how to do was fire a gun. They did not know how to de-escalate a situation, which is what we've seen, obviously, in Minneapolis and other cities with ICE personnel and other federal law enforcement people who were inadequately trained and were given inadequate instruction.
I mean, really inadequately trained. I mean, I've seen, you watched on television now.
And let's talk about your law enforcement.
I'm a peace officer. I'm a licensed peace officer. I've been a peace officer for almost 15 years now. But these guys are jumping out of their car with their guns drawn. Many officers will spend their entire career and maybe pull out their gun once. Many will spend their entire career and not pull out their gun at all. These guys, every time they stop their vehicle, they're jumping out with their guns drawn on a little old lady, So yeah, there's a huge disconnect, and I can see why they would say they're concerned. I'm concerned, So they had some training, I'm sure, but not enough. If you're going to put them in that kind of environment, it's not enough.
Now, one of the things, for those of us who remember the days of being in junior high and high school, and it's like, why do I have to take this history class? Why is it relevant? And it's just a bunch of dates and stuff that doesn't matter to me. It's very easy to go, okay, I understand that this was an important document and it reflects the time, and so I should remember that, but why is it relevant now? And there's a number of reasons, and again, it talks about, It doesn't take you very long to thumb through these pages to see what this report talks about are the things that monopolize our public conversation today. Deploying inadequately trained law enforcement personnel in hostile situations. A lack of awareness or understanding about past or present discrimination. Grossly unequal economic outcomes. And it's not just the issues that are the same that they talked about as we do today, but they had the same fears and concerns and comments about them. You look at their meeting minutes and they go, how do you accurately account for our racial past without denigrating our founding fathers or turning the document into a political manifesto? Those are the words they use. They talk about how do you constructively criticize police without seeming to condemn all police?
Defund the police, right?
Well, exactly. I mean, what kind of answer is that? And then
which blacks never really, that wasn't no charge of many black folks, so people know. Of course, there was a small group that wanted to defund the police because the police they felt were not acting right. Yeah, they were the enemy.
They were the enemy. Yeah. And then there's the, what do you do? How do you write a report when you know there's going to be a segment of the population that's going to say, why are we talking about discrimination? Nobody today owns slaves. And
but you know, I hear you, but many black people feel that, you know, we still have a long way to go, you know.
Well,
walking in black skin is still difficult in the United States. You know, I've talked to you, I had this conversation with you before, you know. I still feel eyes following me when I go in certain stores, you know. It's just the way it is, you know. Unless I have a suit and tie on, and even then, you know, they're questioning,
and
is
to
that
me,
fake?
even if you don't have a suit and tie on, you don't strike me as being a gangbanger.
Right. But the eyes still follow you. It's true. The eyes will still follow you. Even now, I tense up, you know, when I pass police cars, and I'm a police officer, you know. But and this is a true story. I have a friend in New York who was a police officer. He had been a police officer about 2 years. He got pulled over on the Long Island Expressway in New York and beaten by a police officer. And he kept telling them, I'm a police officer. They didn't believe him until the supervisor came running down and said, he's a police officer. But they were literally beating him on the side of the highway.
Tell me, let's talk about the talk.
And that's still real. You know, I don't have any sons.
You know, we talk about the birds and the bees in the Anglo community.
And I'm talking about how to be safe when you go out in the streets, when you go to stores, when you get pulled over by the police officer. You know, this is how you should react as a young man and as a young woman. I've had that same talk with my daughters, as a matter of fact, because, you know, it's scary for them. It is scary to them. But I've had nephews who, you know, I've had to give that talk to about what you do when you get pulled over and how you react when you get pulled over and those kind of things, because those things escalate quickly. And I got 10 minutes, man. So they escalate very, very quickly. So it's scary. We still, walking in our skin still can be very, very scary for African Americans.
You know, and we've talked about, you know, what degree has there been progress? And, you know, my line is there's been undeniable progress, and people will go, well, is the glass half full or half empty? And I always say yes. And, you know, the black poverty rate's been cut in half, and blacks graduate from high school at almost the identical rates as whites. Yet at the same time, there are stories like Darryl's, and no matter how low the national unemployment rate is, black unemployment is still twice that of white.
That's right.
And, you know, we still unfortunately have the George Floyd incidences and things like that. And, you know, it seems to be a reminder, and this is one of the things I've constantly readjusted my view of how much progress we've made through the years. Because I'll be honest with you, until 1992, I thought we were really, really far along. Then came the Rodney King beating and then the subsequent acquittal. And I'm going like, what has happened? And then that sort of made me realize that, yes, we've made progress, because you know, I'm a numbers guy. That's what I had to do for a living for a long, long time. But because I didn't live it, I didn't really know what it was like on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
And we've continually had these Ferguson incidences and George Floyd's and other things that, you know, we've made enormous progress, but I think this report can remind us how deeply embedded the remnants of slavery were. So it's going to take more than 1 or 2 generations to really, really make even more progress.
Slavery and Jim Crow.
Jim Crow, yes, exactly right.
So it's been longer than 150 years. It's been 250 years.
Yes.
Because we lived through that Jim Crow era, which was that was like slavery.
Oh,
African American.
yeah,
So,
exactly.
You know, so I know we only got 10 minutes, but can you, and I want to take a few questions, but what's next? You know, is it going to get better? What's next?
We are seeing things that once upon a time I would have regarded as unrespectable now being respectable.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have national leaders utter them, they sanction that.
Mm-hmm.
And it troubles me because I've often remarked that if my son had said some of the things that our president says when he was 10 years old, he would have been grounded for the rest of his life.
Mm-hmm. True.
And so that's got to be incredibly hard for those with younger children
Mm-hmm.
when a child says something and he goes, well, the president said it. I mean, how do you deal with that?
That's right.
Having said that, I'm greatly worried about what's happened. We've gone down a path I never thought we would, but yet at the same time, I'm still an optimist. And I'll attribute some of that to my mother, as my sister will openly acknowledge. But a lot of it is, if you think about it, to be truly an American, you are an optimist.
Mm-hmm.
Why else would you have gotten on some rickety ship 300 years ago and sailed across the sea to a land where, for all you knew, there was going to be a fire-breathing dragon at the other side?
Mm-hmm.
Or why would you, 100 years after that, have the audacity to think, we're going to declare independence and rebel from the most powerful country in the world, even though nobody else has ever done that? Mm. Or you have to be an optimist if you have been enslaved for 250 years and then been governed by another form of slavery for another 100 years and not led a revolution. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or even more contemporary, those who have chosen to come to this America, to this country. Maybe they've walked thousands of miles. Maybe they've come in on a boat. Maybe they've flown on a plane somewhere. But they've come to a country where people don't look like them, can't pronounce their name, and don't necessarily like the God they pray to. But yet they're optimists. Right. So because we have gone through difficult times before, we often think that whatever is happening here right now has never happened before, but oftentimes it really has, and we've survived. I think we can. But that doesn't mean we can do that passively. Right. We have to be very, very active. Right. And it's not a case of just, I'm going to vote because it's the presidential election or the gubernatorial one. We've got to vote when it's the school board election and city council election. That's where real change starts. All movements, whether it's the abolition movement, suffragette, even the Tea Party, they start at the individual level. That's right. Individuals really, really do matter, like Tip O'Neill once said. And when you think about that, the turnout at city council elections and school board elections is less than 10%, it really only takes a handful of individuals to affect real change. That's right. My wife and I live in a city council district where we had an open seat recently. And we had like the highest turnout of any of the city council elections. 6% turned out to vote. 6%. And that was it. So there's a way to do that. And you and I have often joked that even in an organization as large as Dallas County, we're the 8th largest county in the United States, all it takes is 8 phone calls to change policy in Dallas County. And it's very easy to really get a meeting with your city council member, your school board member, or your county commissioner. You just have to do that. That's right. And if you make the effort, I think you'd be surprised about what the benefits of being involved are. That's right. If nothing else, the last few years should have reminded us, rights are never given. They have to be demanded. And you have to maintain them. You have to persevere. You can't take them for granted because people will take them away from you.
And rights have to be protected.
Yes.
Yeah, they have to be protected. Do we have questions?
Oh, she's got pictures. Oh, she's got cards. This is like Karnak and Johnny Carson, huh?
Unfortunately, we only have time for like 1 or 2, so.
Sorry. Thank you.
Oh, good. I don't have to put my glasses on. Yes, I do. I thought I didn't have to.
Maybe 3.
Oh, wow, more.
Are there examples of recommendations that were implemented that have since been reversed, either in past 50, 60 years, 50 years, or more recently, like a Trump administration 1 and 2?
Well, the funding for some of the programs has gone up and down over time. And I don't think that's necessarily, a Trump administration policy. I think the biggest thing is obviously what their perspective has been on things like the Civil Rights Division and the Justice Department, and clearly the Supreme Court decision that strips sort of the enforcement authority of the Voting Rights Act. That's been a significant thing as well. You know, the Kerner Report had nothing to do with the Voting Rights Act, but that's part and parcel associated with that.
That's right. Well, I mean, it did in a sense in terms of, you know, wanting to have people who influence you look like you.
Yes.
You know, so electing people to office who represent who you are, you know, so I think that was important. So how's the Kerner Report best applied to today's politics, perhaps relative to immigration fears?
Immigration fears. Well, I'll go back to the commission's meeting minutes and its testimony. You know, they talk about, and they say this, an appalling lack of knowledge among white America about what it's like to be black in 1967. And I think that is why we have such a misunderstanding and the hysteria associated with DEI and the teaching of race today.
Right.
If you think that in 1970, only a fourth of America, present-day America, was alive in 1970.
Right.
So their world is one of, well, we elected an African-American president twice and another one vice president once, and we have somebody as influential as Oprah Winfrey. So the civil rights struggle has been won, and we don't need anything.
Right.
And so they don't understand that. I think that's a lot of what you see with the immigration situation, is they don't really understand why people are coming and what their impact is on us.
Right.
They are not taking our jobs away from us. They are working hard. They are starting small businesses on their own. They're paying taxes.
And not getting any benefit from it.
That's exactly right. You know, and you know, we're seeing extended to people who are here legally, but because they look like they're immigrants.
Right.
And maybe they were once, but they're now here legally.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, you see why I spend a lot of time with this guy, right? he helps me be an optimist and stay grounded. So.
I don't know about that.
So thank you so much.
Thank you, Darryl. Okay.